Canadian armed forces first arrived in Afghanistan in late 2001, shortly after the U.S. and British forces began a full-scale military operation to oust al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The combat mission ended for Canada in 2014 at a cost of more than 160 Canadian lives and more than $15 billion. But as that war continues, now under the third U.S. president to have carriage of it, inevitable questions arise about what Canada's efforts accomplish there. Joining us now on that, from the nation's capital, Stephen Seideman, Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University. And here in our studio, Aisha Ahmad. She is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, co-director of the Islam and Global Affairs Initiative at the Munk School of Global Affairs, and the author most recently of Jihad & Co., Black Markets and Islamist Power. And John Thompson, National Security Analyst, formerly president of the Mackenzie Institute. And it's good to have you two back here in our studio. Stephen, nice to see you in the nation's capital as well. Let me just set the table for our discussion by reading a little fact file here, and then we'll get into our conversation. Canada did spend more than 12 years in Afghanistan. In December of 2001, the first Canadian troops, the Special Forces Unit Joint Task Force 2, JTF2, they set foot on Afghanistan soil. Almost a decade later, in July of 2011, Canada formally ended its combat mission. Canadian forces remained to train Afghan security forces until March of 2014. There were 158 Canadian Armed Forces casualties and 4 civilian casualties. And here's Mei Jiang writing in OpenCanada.com in July of last year. The longest military engagement in Canadian history, the war in Afghanistan cost taxpayers as much as $22 billion, according to one estimate. And yet, to many who participated in it, it remains unclear what the war accomplished or what the endeavor was even for. We didn't understand what we were doing or what we were going into. A former Canadian official who worked in Kandahar told me the military didn't want the war they ended up fighting. They wanted a paler, softer, lighter, more diluted version of the reality. All right, that's some feedback to what this country has undergone over the last decade and more. And let us start with, Stephen, you in the nation's capital. Take us back. Why did we go in the first place?
Very simply, our ally was attacked. Article 5 of the NATO treaty was invoked a few days after 9/11. And so when the United States went to Afghanistan after it was attacked on 9/11, Canada, along with a bunch of other American allies, joined in. First, through an ad hoc unilateral effort that was called Operation Enduring Freedom. And then once that was done and the Taliban were overthrown, there was a UN-blessed mission, the International Security Assistance Force, that had been put in place to help the government of Afghanistan, and eventually that became a NATO mission. And the key thing to keep in mind in all of this is that Canada was never alone. It did pretty much what everybody else did in Afghanistan. Everybody in NATO showed up in one way or another. Canada carried a bit more of its load than some others, but every NATO ally and a lot of partners were part of the mission.
Well, that, of course, is the key point. We were obligated, as Stephen tells us, to go. The question then becomes, what do you do when you're there? Our initial, Aisha, commitment, I think, was to go for a couple of years. We stayed well beyond a couple of years. How come?
Well, I mean, I think that Steve just made a really important point about the fact is that we entered into Afghanistan as part of a mission in response to the terrorist attacks on 9/11. We were obligated to go. It was our duty to go. Now, how that mission unfolded committed us for the long haul, because in that crucial moment between 2001 and 2002, how do you overthrow the Taliban? And in fact, the U.S.-led intervention made some incredibly determining decisions that had a long-term impact on the conflict. Primarily, what they decided to do was, in order to overthrow the Taliban, that they would go back and ally with the warlords of the Northern Alliance who had been fighting in Afghanistan during the Civil War period. They were the ones that had taken over Afghanistan after the end of the Soviet Union, and then the Taliban had pushed them out. And so in that crucial moment, instead of it just being a pure NATO mission, the United States made the decision to give money and guns to these militias that had allied together against the Taliban and said, go win that war that you had lost back in the 1990s, and we'll back you. Now that opened the Pandora's box. That was a situation where once we had empowered these individuals, a government was then created that gave them political power that then needed to be sustained and has created over a decade of long-term security problems that the international community continues to deal with.
Let me explore that with John. How did our mission evolve over the time that we were there?
Well, it's partly the nature of Afghanistan. Remember that Afghanistan has not known a year's peace since 1972. And it was pretty ungovernable for much of its history. It's part of the nature of the territory. Civil government doesn't really last there very long or isn't very strongly entrenched. Now, for decades, the Afghan war had been generating refugees. It'd been in headlines for years. It was constantly causing trouble. Was in effect a failed state, or as near as damn it as one can be. So, okay, we had troops here, we had resources here, they had our attention. Let's fix things up. Let's demine the country. Let's rebuild roads and bridges. Let people come home and leave something stable for once. And it didn't quite work.
Well, we're going to follow up on that a little later on. Stephen, though, if I understand this then, the initial thing that got us into the war was coming to the assistance of the United States as per our responsibilities under NATO. It then turned into a mission about protecting women's rights and allowing girls to go to school and trying to build the country into something more stable. What in your judgment does that reflect? The fact that the mission kept changing over the years, what does that reflect?
Well, it reflects the inability of the Canadian government to message properly, because the mission was always about NATO, it was always about supporting the ally. It was trying to build some stability in Afghanistan, but it was never really about girls in schools. It was never really about democracy. It was never really about a lot of things that became the face of the mission. It was really about supporting an ally and trying to make sure that Afghanistan was not a place from which terrorist attacks could be launched against the West. That was it. That was all it really was about for the entire mission. But as the mission itself evolved, because what it took to do that job changed as it became clear that the United States was not interested in governance of the rest of the country. It became ISAF's job, and it became NATO's job from 2005 onwards, that the mission went from being very focused on Kabul to being spread throughout the country. So that was the big change, was Canada doing some work in Kandahar in 2002 as part of the effort to overthrow the Taliban, to go into Kabul from 2003 to 2004 to help stabilize the situation there. It was very much like a peacekeeping mission. But then the big change was 2005 onwards, when the decision was made to try for NATO to have bits and pieces of order throughout the country around these provincial reconstruction teams. There was around 30 of them, and Canada chose the one in Kandahar because Kandahar was a central point of logistics. It wouldn't have to rely on flying anywhere else. It would just fly everything into Kandahar. It wouldn't need its own helicopters. And it was a visible place to do the work. That became the mission. When people think about the mission now, they think about that period from 2005 to 2011, because that was when it was very violent, both because Canadians were getting killed and because Canadians were doing the killing.
Aisha, I recall well government saying this is about creating a stable nation in the heart of Asia. This is about making sure young girls can go to school. This is about making sure that people can play music in public. You're shaking your head. That was not the mission?
No, that has nothing to do with, I mean, frankly, this was the information operations that maybe dressed up the war in a way that Canadians might be able to relate to a little bit more, but nothing about the war in Afghanistan was motivated by the need to get more Afghan girls in school. Now that became one of the the acts that we attempted to execute in Afghanistan. But in fact, what happened by making education and social change part of the mission was a type of ideological warfare that we then participated in Afghanistan, putting forward what we imagined to be our ideals and politicizing spaces like schools and politicizing women's bodies in a way in which we participated in an ideological battle with the enemy in such a way that distracted from what Steve very correctly pointed to was in fact the original mission, which was, to make sure that Afghanistan isn't a space in which terrorist attacks can be launched. Now that said, we can have a very interesting conversation about whether or not this type of warfare does that job, but it absolutely wasn't about women, it wasn't about schools. That was the window dressing that was added later.
Well, here's what the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper had to say in May of 2011. He visited our troops in Kandahar and he said the following: "You have to look at this mission as a great success. The world came to Afghanistan because Afghanistan had become such a terrible and brutal place, it had become a threat to the entire world. Whatever the challenges and troubles that remain, Afghanistan is no longer a threat to the world. Okay, John, let's take that on. Are Canadians, is the rest of the world safer today because of what Canada contributed in Afghanistan?
Yes and no. Basically, we stomped flat on al-Qaeda. It's battered into a dozen different franchises, which are all busy trying to replicate what happened in Afghanistan and other places. Then, of course, we've also seen the outgrowth of ISIS. And there's one old rule in a counterinsurgency campaign when you're fighting an ideological opponent. Never let them control territory. Because if they control territory, they have a territorial base from which to expand. The other thing, as we have known from so many ideological opponents in the 20th century, is there's nothing crueler than an ideological ruler. You know, we know that from Stalin, we know that from Hitler, and we know that from ISIS. I mean, but it's something we don't talk about, actually, that, you know, you're trying to, in our own ghastly way, try and protect people from something even worse. And also, ideological warfare is hard to conduct. I mean, it's cruel. You're reaching for what's that old line from Henry V, you know, if you hide the crown even in your hearts, there I will rake for it.
Stephen, we heard Stephen Harper call this mission a great success. Was it in your view?
It again depends on what the goal was. If the goal was to be a good ally to the United States, to support the NATO, to make sure that that multilateral organization stuck around and was still relevant, then it was successful. To be fair, Kandahar was a better place while we were there. That Canada helped to improve the economy, that the city itself was more secure, even if the outer line areas were not. Two things we have to keep in mind. One is that we never had enough forces. Every NATO country showed up with too few forces, and so we really couldn't do the job that was advertised because we couldn't really clear, hold, and build. We didn't have enough troops for that until the American surge in 2010. The second thing we have to keep in mind is it was only sustainable while we were there. The goal of a self-sustaining Afghanistan was never reached. It was only stable, more or less, while we were there. However, one way to measure success now is that of all the places that have faced conflict in Afghanistan since we left, Kandahar has remained, the Afghan government has not lost Kandahar, whereas Helmand, there have been parts of Helmand where the British were that have been lost. Kunduz, where the Germans were operating, they've lost the city center a couple different times. So one way to measure success now is, yes, Canada was able to do a good enough job that they built enough stability. So even though the war goes on, Kandahar hasn't fallen. It didn't fall under Canada's watch, which I think was the real contribution of the Canadian forces. And it hasn't fallen after Canada's watch was over with. So that might be an indicator that Canada had a lasting impact. But this stuff is very hard, and we weren't there long enough to make anything permanent.
Aisha, your view on whether it was a quote-unquote great success?
You know, respectfully, Steve, I disagree. I think that, you know, if we're going to talk about expending you know, lives and treasure, Canadian lives and treasure, that we have to have a better benchmark for success and a more clearly defined benchmark in advance about what this mission is supposed to accomplish. Now, first, I'm just going to have to address something that John said in terms of, you know, insurgencies and holding territory. Frankly, modern jihadist insurgencies, they adapt to territorial losses in such a way that actually makes them more dangerous when they lose territory. We see this in Mogadishu. You know, the last two terrorist attacks, Al-Shabaab lost territory. They engage in more violent, more aggressive types of hit-and-run terrorist-style attacks that have very significant casualties. They can disrupt and maintain for the long haul. And then when they're closer to, when the international community is exhausted and pulls back, then they can reassert and regain territory. So they're able to adapt for the long haul.
They're down but not out.
They're you know, they are able to stay in the game for the long haul. And so on the one hand, we don't have a good measure for, you know, their resilience over the long haul. And just because Kandahar hasn't been toppled, that also speaks to some of the local power dynamics. And as I mentioned earlier about, you know, which warlords are in charge of which territories and where the Taliban do and do not have opportunities. You know, so I think that that's a really problematic way of looking at whether or not Canada's role is successful.
So let me jump in then. You said you don't like the metrics by which Stephen determined that it was a great success, or where he suggested it was a
great success.
No, right. Where you thought there was success, and you pointed out that Kandahar,
yes.
Kandahar is a notable exception. So what are your metrics for determining, Aisha, whether or not this was a success?
Well, I mean, So there is something implicit in your question, which is that there's a baseline of success for which I can then measure. I think Steve's argument, if it was successful in that Canada demonstrated that it's a reliable ally to NATO. If we're looking on the ground in terms of progress in Afghanistan, I mean, this is a mess. I mean, the vice president of Afghanistan, General Rashid Dostum, is accused of personally raping the governor of Jowzjan. I mean, the political landscape in Afghanistan is, highly dysfunctional right now, and that's deeply related to the Taliban insurgency, which has since fragmented. And in fact, I think that the fragmentation of the Taliban insurgency, the radicalization of the Taliban insurgency, the splintering of Al-Qaeda into more splinter groups, regionally located splinter groups across the world, has actually across the board made the world more dangerous. If you look at the data, there is more Islamist insurgency now than there was by 9/11 by a tremendous rate.
So, John, we shouldn't have gone?
I think we should have gone, and there is actually one metric that we can go on. Remember that in 2000, Al-Qaeda had training camps. There were thousands of people coming through. They were learning skills that are very hard to teach, very sophisticated bomb-making skills. Remember, we found their labs where they were experimenting with chemical weaponry. They don't have those capabilities now. The big structure, the big infrastructure they were developing vanished.
So that's a plus. What about all the things I should mention?
That's a plus, but the other thing is that no other group, troubling as Al-Shabaab is and troubling as some of these other groups are, they've not been able to rebuild that capability. We're also now, I sort of think of it, this is the third wave. The first wave was the big attacks, like the African embassy bombings in 9/11. Our defenses against those are pretty good now. The second wave were big attacks inside countries like 7/7 or the Madrid bombings. And again, that's more a domestic defense, but our defenses are good against that. This third wave is the sort of the do-it-yourself with anything to hand, a knife or a truck. And we almost have no defenses against that. But that's still not as deadly as killing 3,000 people in one day.
We have to, I think Steve put this on the record, which is 158 Canadian forces' lives were lost. We spent somewhere between $15 and $22 billion on this war. So you have to, when trying to understand what was accomplished, put it in those terms. Was it worth the expense of that blood and treasure, in your view?
I think, again, one of the things that has changed over time is how we measure these things, because we just had the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Vimy, where thousands of guys died in a single day, and it was to take a hill, right? And so these days, 158 lives over the course of 14 years or so, is that a lot or a little? We tend to think it's a lot. And I don't want to be too bloody about it, but militaries are there for the country to exert their national interests, to pursue they're an instrument of foreign policy. And so Canada is in an alliance for a reason. It's an alliance because for a variety of reasons. One is it wants other countries to support it when it is facing difficult situations. It wants to build multilateral institutions so that way the United States doesn't go wandering around the world without any kind of ties. We saw what happened like that in 2003. And so it wants to have NATO continue to exist. And NATO has been a force for stability in Europe for a long time now. And so Canada sacrificed lives and it sacrificed money to do that. Could it have been done better? Absolutely. I think Aisha points to a lot of the problems. She hasn't even mentioned how we designed the Constitution, which sent all the political accountability for the governor of Kandahar to Kabul as opposed to the people of Kandahar. All kinds of mistakes were made. Again, 2003 was a huge mistake. But in terms of what Canada was there to do, it was there to as part of an alliance that it supports and is part of the larger Canadian national interest. So yes, it was worth it. It was a high cost, but that's the way alliances go. And Canada wants NATO to stick around and be relevant in the future. One of the challenges we have in Asia is we have no NATO equivalent. So Canada has a hard time figuring out how it belongs to the situations with Japan and South Korea and North Korea and all the rest. It doesn't fit, but it fits in Europe. And so it's making a contribution these days to peace and stability in Latvia and in the Baltics. So yes, it was worth it. But if we talk about the checklist that was developed in 2008, that was mostly a checklist of things to accomplish that way we could leave and say that we accomplished something, whether that's 50 schools or a dam or polio eradication. One thing to keep in mind is the lessons learned report that was developed after this war. Do not use the word war or winning in all of it. So that speaks to the changing metrics the government had about what was thinking it was doing.
Aisha, in which case, what, in your view, were the key military lessons that we learned as a result of all the time our Canadian forces spent in Afghanistan?
I think there are a lot of lessons that we learned, and that's why, as Steve very rightly pointed out, things changed politically along the way, but that's because there was learning from the ground. And certainly there was learning in terms of, what types of counterinsurgency work and what doesn't. Is hearts and minds. We jumped from hearts and minds, provincial reconstruction teams. We tried a bunch of different things. One thing that I think we absolutely can take away from this, as well as, and we look forward to other peacekeeping missions, is the level of complexity on the ground. And one of the most important lessons is that the local partners that you ally with are going to determine the outcome in the long run. And so if we partner with toxic people, the mission becomes toxic. If we partner with groups that have a virtuous track record, we have a better likelihood of success.
Listen, you know way more about
Afghanistan in 2001?
That's exactly what I was going to say. My hunch is there's way more toxic people than Thomas Jefferson riding in on a white horse over there. So
I agree with you that it was difficult, but the expediency of showing up and bringing guns and cash to General Dostum meant we chose the worst of the worst, and the decision to choose the worst of the worst was because there was a belief that they could win the ground game, and the fact is that by using fewer of our resources, and Steve made mention of 158 soldiers, we grieve every last one of them, and yet we made a strategic decision, all of NATO, to put in fewer boots on the ground at that time so that we could use Dostum's forces to do the dirty work. That was an expedient choice that really cost us in the long run.
John, what do you think we learned about the notion of sending troops halfway around the world in order to potentially build a more democratic society in the heart of Asia?
Well, it was our first counterinsurgency campaign since 1885. So, I mean, we didn't really have any experience in this. And Canadian soldiers had to learn a lot of it on the ground as they went. I think the other point, though, is going abroad, hazarding lives, spending money is what the armed forces are for. It's the constant payment, the investment in stability. I mean, let's face it, in 1945, a war ended that killed 76.8 million people over 6 years, 33,500 people a day. We haven't fought a war like that since. Getting involved in the Congo, getting people blown up over the Golan Heights on a UN observation mission, standing in the way of Cyprus, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia, that cost us too a lot. But that's keeping the peace. That's real peacekeeping. And the world has been stable for 72 years because we invest money and hazard the lives of our soldiers.
Well, you mentioned the word peacekeeping there, and Steve, let me get you on that. There's been a great debate in this country over the last couple of decades about whether or not our efforts are best spent trying to keep a peace that may or may not exist in various theaters around the world, or being active military practitioners on a side trying to, win whatever victory is defined as. What do we know? What do we better know about that equation today that we didn't know before we went into Afghanistan?
We know that's a false choice because we actually did combat in Bosnia and Croatia. We actually have lost lives in Cyprus. That one of the lessons the bad guys learned in the 1990s is to shoot at the peacekeepers. That the Bosnian Serbs took UN peacekeepers hostages, which is why you needed a NATO intervention. That in Rwanda, the first thing the genocidaires did was take out a bunch of Belgian peacekeepers and shot them in the head. So one of the things we learned is that the peacekeeping of the 1950s doesn't exist today. And as Aisha suggested, all these situations, whether they're counterinsurgency or a peacekeeping effort, they're far more complex, they're far more kinetic. That means they're far more violent than they used to be. And so wherever this government decides to go, their troops are going to be being put in harm's way. And whether it's a training mission like Iraq, where our troops were near and on the front line, so they took a casualty or two, and they also engaged in some killing. All these things, one of the lessons that we need to learn is that all of these environments will involve combat. We will not call them combat operations because that's politically unwise to do, but they will all involve combat. They will all involve our troops defending themselves and our special forces in particular going out and killing people. And so one of the things that Afghanistan might have done is help to clarify the reality of modern war, which is it involves death. It involves killing people and involves trying to be careful about making sure that you're discriminate in your use of force and that you're careful about how you deploy your troops so that they're not put in as much harm's way as they could be. One of the things we learned in Afghanistan was to give the troops on the ground more freedom, more discretion to make the hard decisions so that they're not put in situations like Srebrenica where the Dutch had to stand by and watch people get killed. One of the things that we haven't talked about at all is that we now have learned lessons about how to put civilians in harm's way. We didn't talk about the other part of the whole of government effort, which is sending foreign affairs and aid people into harm's way. One of the first things that really changed the mission in Afghanistan was Glenn Berry, who was the head of the provincial reconstruction team, was killed almost at the very outset of the mission. And that changed things because suddenly we had to have rules about how to keep our civilians behind the wire. We had to figure out how to give these folks benefits so that way that their survivors can live on in case their main provider, if it happens to be their main provider, is killed in Afghanistan. That we didn't have the kind of benefits that our soldiers have, whether it's survivor benefits or injury and disability benefits. And we learned how to deal with that better once we started realizing we're putting foreign affairs officers in harm's way. So that's an important lesson that we'd have to do in a Mali or in South Sudan or wherever else, that there'll be civilians in harm's way. So I think we've figured that out a little bit, although there's still a lot of lessons to be learned.
Aisha, I'm literally down to my last 30 seconds, and I want to get you on this notion of whether the way we remember peacekeeping in this country from many years ago, are those days gone in terms of our military future?
Absolutely. And, you know, Steve just mentioned Mali. I was in Mali just this year, and I got to tell you, the situation on the ground there is just as fragmented. You have ethnic and tribal insurgents. There's no good guys, and I mean, there's no good guys to be allying with. And so if we enter into that conflict, we're looking at jihadists, ethnic factions, tribal factions, narco-traffickers, human traffickers.
So don't is your advice.
Well, if we do, then we are spending a whole lot of blood and treasure to experience exactly what we just went through.
I want to thank all of you for participating in our program tonight. Stephen Seidemann, the Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University, thanks for being there on the line for us in the nation's capital. Aisha Ahmad from the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. John Thompson, the National Security Analyst, formerly with the Mackenzie Institute. Great discussion, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.